Hello and welcome. Maps are very, very useful things, especially when you are lost, because they help you reorient yourself. You can recognize where you are and you can make a plan of where you're going to go next. So today's video is essentially a verbal map. We're going to be looking at the stagnation, frustration, and recrimination cycle. And this is a cycle that many anxious, frustrated, worried speakers go through all the time. And in fact, even good speakers sometimes get stuck in this cycle as well at different points in their speaking career. So I'm going to talk through the map so you can understand where you are. And I'm going to talk about how you can recognize what's going on and what you can do about it. So today we're going to be looking at why you get fed up of being an anxious speaker and how to get out of that cycle. But why is that important? Why is it important to recognize where we are? And why is it important to make a plan of where we're going to go next? Now, it might sound a little bit mad. I say this in most videos now. It might sound a little bit mad, but it's actually a good thing that you're feeling fed up. It's a good thing that you're frustrated at being an anxious speaker, because that means you're almost at the point where you can do something about it. Yeah. So if we can use that frustration in a good way, if we can channel it in a really good way, it means that you're very close to moving out of being a frustrated, anxious speaker and moving into being a calmer, collected, more confident speaker. You're ready to start coping with speaking at work or within your community. So actually being frustrated is not a bad place to be, as long as you recognize that's where you are and you know what's going to happen next, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So you're ready to do it before it becomes something harder and more intractable. So if you are feeling frustrated, this is good. It means we can do something about it. Now, if you've moved on from feeling frustrated and you've dropped into the recrimination part, we're going to talk a bit more deeply about that in a minute. But if you've dropped into that recrimination part, if your inner critic is having a bit of a party and giving you a pretty hard time, don't worry, there's still things we can do at that stage to move you back into a place where you can start to make significant and impactful changes. Nothing is lost. There's no point where we're too deep in that we can't recover it. And what's really great is that once you start to deal with those frustrations, when you start to kind of recognize and accept where you are, you've got a chance to move to the other side. Now, when you get to the other side of that frustration or that stagnation or the recrimination, you have a genuine chance to deal with your fear of speaking. And then once you've gotten to the other side of that, that means you get to start doing the things at work and in life or in your community that are really going to make a difference to you and to the people that you work and live with. So there's so much opportunity on the other side of getting past this stagnation and frustration and recrimination that you might be going through at the moment. There's real, tangible benefits on the other side. Because, and I've said this before in many other of my videos, and I know that it's something that I will keep saying because this is absolutely true. The way that we show up as human beings, the way that we stand, the way that we breathe, the way we speak and gesture indicates to anybody else that's listening or watching how competent we are at our job, or their perceived competence, right? We might be absolutely brilliant at our job and not enjoy speaking up at all. Now, we're still competent at our job, but the perception that everybody else has of us is that we're not as good at our job as we actually are. And obviously that impacts your career. That slows your progression down. It's going to limit your opportunities. So if we're recognizing that you're frustrated at being an anxious speaker, then you have the opportunity to do something about that, move to the other side of it, deal with your fear of speaking and start taking up those opportunities. Because once you start being perceived as a more confident speaker, people will recognize just how good you are at your job. It's unfair, I know, but it is the truth of the society that we live in, and it's frustrating. but it is where we are. So better to work with what we know than to pretend that it's not there, or just say, well, it's not fair, and stamp our feet, because that doesn't work either. So when I'm doing these videos, I generally talk about clients. I talk about my client successes, because I love talking about all the things that they achieve when they've got through this cycle, they've moved out the other side, and they start doing these amazing things in their life. And it gives me such pleasure, and I'm so proud of what they do. But actually, today I'm going to talk about me. And I don't do this very often, but I think it's worth saying this, because I know from absolute personal experience what it's like to lose your voice, to not want to speak up, to not want to share your opinions. When I had my first child, I stopped work. I was the operations director of a startup. We had 30 full-time employees and thousands of freelancers. And I loved my job, and it was so much fun. It was really, really fun. And part of my job was working with speakers at conferences, and I just loved it. Then I stopped and had my first child, and I got hit with a hefty dose of postnatal depression. And I really found it difficult to speak up and use my voice at that stage. Then on top of that, I went and then had 5 miscarriages straight in a row. I had IVF for my daughter, which was quite stressful. And over the 8 years that this was going on, and with me being at home, I just got quieter and quieter and quieter. I wouldn't share my opinions. I wouldn't speak up. I really found it difficult to advocate for myself in any meaningful way. But I then went and did a master's degree in voice coaching and training, because I knew that I wanted to get back to helping speakers at conferences and other things as well. And that voice work, it worked. It really worked. As you can see, I don't fear speaking up anymore. I speak at conferences, I run programs, I teach people how to get over the fear of speaking, I teach leadership skills, I teach people to do TED Talks. So I found that doing the voice work, you can get to the other side, and the other side of being fearful is amazing. And I see it in my clients all the time, the incredible things that they've done with their businesses, with their careers, with their clients, making ripples out into the world. It's been really, really incredible. So I know from personal experience that it works. And I know from my clients' experience that it works. So if you're somebody who's feeling really fed up with being an anxious speaker, who's just really at the end of their tether with it all, I want you to hear this and know this. It is absolutely possible to feel differently. It is absolutely possible to start feeling like you can speak up, that you can make a difference in your workplace or in your community, and you can just feel like that you're really contributing your best in everyday situations. So just know that there is somewhere on the other side of where you're feeling right now, which is amazing. And it does take a bit of work. And I'm not going to pretend that it's an easy journey and that we can just click our fingers or take a magic pill and it's all sorted. It isn't. It does take some work, and there will be setbacks along the way, but it is totally, totally possible. But what I want to talk about today is not so much the journey. I will talk about that in other videos, and oh my goodness, for days. But what I want to talk about today is how we notice what's going on at the beginning. So how do we notice where we are at that beginning stage before we start to do any work? And generally with my clients, there's 3 stages, and I've created a model for this. And it's a circular model, and we can kind of go around the model multiple times. But essentially it starts with stagnation. We move on to frustration, and we end with recrimination. Now, sometimes we can step back into frustration and we can go around the cycle again, but essentially that is the model. So we're going to talk about that really fully in a minute. We're going to talk about how do you recognize each of those stages, and we're going to talk about what you can personally do to move yourself on and through that phase into a space where you could start to tackle your speaking anxiety. But before we dive into that model and all those specifics, struggle there, all those specifics, I want to talk about some fundamental things. So the what I think is going to be really, really important, what is always important in all voice work, in all of this process, is that the very first stage of any of this work is noticing. So it's very easy to stop noticing. It's just, I just hate speaking. But that's a very blanket thing. Yeah, it's a very blanket idea. And we want to get a little bit more nuanced. We want to get a little bit more specific about what's going on. So our first job, whenever we're doing any of this kind of work, is notice. So we want to notice, how does it feel in our body? What are the thoughts that we're thinking? How does it feel in our throat? What's going on in our mouths? All of that sensations. We want to start noticing it and being really specific about what's going on. So it could be, if you're at a team meeting and you're waiting for your turn to speak and you're going to have to update them on the project that you're working on, maybe you get a tightness in your throat. Maybe it feels like there's a little bit of apple that's got stuck in your throat. Maybe you can just really hear your heart beating, or actually you can only really hear the blood in your ears. You can't hear anything else. You've stopped listening to what's going on further around the table. So beginning to notice physical sensations or thoughts that we're having is the absolutely fundamental piece before we start doing any other kind of work. Now, the second fundamental block, if you like, is acceptance, acknowledgement, and acceptance. So we need to acknowledge that's where we are. We need to know, it's like, okay, so you're sitting at that table, it's your turn is coming. It's like acknowledging where you are. It's like, okay, I've got that lump in my throat again, or I can only really hear the blood in my ears. I can just acknowledging that's where you are is super helpful. We sort of stop fighting ourselves. We stop fighting the body rather than doing that. Oh God, my heart's really racing, or I can't hear. We're fighting our own body at that stage. If we kind of go, okay, well that's how it is. I'm feeling like this. Then it is much easier to accept where we are. And it's easier to move on from there. I'll give you an example. I had a little bit of a frustrating day yesterday. There were several things that I was hoping were going to happen, and they didn't happen in the way that I wanted them to happen. They are happening, but not quite as I wanted. And I was a little bit frustrated with the process and a bit disappointed. And there were various other things that were going on. So I didn't have any meetings. I shut my computer down and I went for a walk. And what I did was I walked and I talked. I'm a verbal processor, so I like to talk out loud. If you ever meet me on a dog walk, you'll think I'm quite mad. But I was talking out loud and I was saying, well, I'm feeling really frustrated because I thought this thing was going to happen and it hasn't happened in the way that I want it to happen. And now I'm going to have to do this. And that's really frustrating and I'm very annoyed about this and I'm a bit angry about that. And so I was just acknowledging how I was feeling. And, that had caused a little bit of tightness in my throat. So I did a bit of breathing. And so I was just kind of like, okay, well, this is how I'm feeling. These are the sensations that are going on in my body. And accepting that that's where I was today. It's like, okay, well, this is where I am. And I said to myself, okay, well, you've got your walk, which was kind of an hour long. You can have a little pity party. You can be cross. You can be angry. You can even shout if you like. You can do all of those things whilst you're on that walk. But by the time you finish that walk, we're really going to let that go, because I will have accepted where I am. So noticing, acknowledging, and for me, I like to do that out loud. I'm a verbal processor, as I said, and not always possible at work, just a caveat. And accepting where we are is so helpful, because by the time that walk was over, it's like, okay, well, maybe I could do this. And, if I did that, that would be really helpful. And suddenly I was in a place where I could move forward and I wasn't stuck in that frustration. Now, if I'd stayed at my desk and stewed in that feeling and not really analysed or verbally processed, I wouldn't have moved forward. I wouldn't have been able to come up with the solutions that I came up with, which actually are fine. So acknowledging and accepting where you are is so important to be able to move forward, because at that stage, you're ready to take action. Okay, so now you've got that fundamental piece in place, we can talk about the model. So I'm going to talk about each of the phases, how you could recognize it, and what you can personally do. Don't need anything but maybe a piece of paper and a pen or a notebook. What you can do to move yourself out of that stage and get yourself ready to start dealing with your fear of speaking. So the first stage is stagnation. So how do you recognize if you are stagnating? Well, it's pretty straightforward. You will feel like you're doing the same thing over and over and over. So your work might feel like a little bit groundhog. It's like I'm doing the same things over and over. I don't really need to think about it. I don't need to really kind of process what I'm doing. I'm just doing the same things. You will also notice that you are, I never like to say the word never, but never, very often not stepping out of your comfort zone. So if there's anything that feels like a little bit stretchy, you're a categoric no. And that's another sign. It's like you say no to everything. So everything is a blanket, nope, not doing that. Rather than a, would I really like to do that? Or is that something that's just a bit beyond my capability at the moment? So I'll give you an example. If somebody said to me, Emma, will you go and sing on national TV tomorrow? For me, that is a categoric no. Yeah, because it's going to save me and my family from utter humiliation. Can't sing a note. If somebody said to me, will you come and speak at our conference? We've got 5,000 women who want to talk about women in leadership. 5,000 people, that's quite a lot. That feels like a little bit stretchy, but it also feels quite exciting. So, I need to think about it. I need to think about what I wanted to say. I need to think about all of those kinds of things. Would it fit with my diary? All that sort of stuff. And then I can say yes or no to it. And I might say no because the timings might not work. Or I might say yes because the timings do work and it still feels a bit stretchy. But I'm not doing a categoric no to absolutely everything. So just notice, are you saying no to absolutely everything without ever really, really thinking about it? And are you avoiding things that will stretch you? So are you actively giving work to other people? Are you sidestepping things? Are you making yourself smaller, hiding away so that you aren't given things that will be a little bit more stretchy or challenging? So those are the ways to recognize if you're in a stagnated state. And what can you do about it? Because obviously now you've recognized where you are, probably don't want to stay there because it doesn't feel very pleasant. It's like it's okay and it's safe and there's no real danger, but it's not really very nourishing is the word that comes to mind here. It's not very nourishing. So what can you do about it? So the first thing is go back to those fundamental building blocks that we just talked about. Notice, acknowledge, accept. So how does it feel? How do you feel every day? What's the feeling in your body? What are the thoughts that you're having? How does it feel to be in this stagnated state? And then accept, okay, well, that's where I am. This is where I am for today. Acknowledge it first of all, and then accept it. It's like acknowledge it. That might be verbally processing it. It might be drawing it out. It might be writing it out. You could record it on your phone. It doesn't really matter, but however you might do it. And you might do it all internally if you're an internal processor. You might do it externally if you're an external processor. You might talk to somebody else about it, but just acknowledging this is where I am, this is what it feels like, and then accepting, okay, that's where I am, this is a fact, and that's all right, because it doesn't have to stay the same. Okay, just because it is now doesn't mean it will always be like this. So just acknowledging that that's where we are for now, and we can move forward if we choose to. Then I'm going to challenge you to get a little bit more nuanced and sophisticated with your noticing, because the first stage of noticing is quite big things to notice, what's going on in your body and the thoughts that you're having. I want you to notice what you're saying no to. So you can keep a little log, paper and pencil if you want, on your phone, doesn't really matter. Keep a log for all the things that you say no to. Yeah, it doesn't matter what it is. You say no to something, go, oh, I said no, write it down. No, write it down. No, write it down. And at the end of the week, I just want to look back and look at that list. And it's a good idea to do this weekly because you'll see just how many things you say no to. Have a look back at that list and have a think about it and say, what did it get me? What did I gain by saying no to these things? Yeah. And what did I avoid by saying no to these things? And if you can do that, that's a really helpful kind of second layer of noticing, accepting and acknowledging where you are. Okay, so first of all, you're going to do that on a physical sense. Notice, acknowledge and accept thoughts, feelings, sensations in your body, and then notice what you're saying no to. And that is usually enough to move us through that stagnation phase and pop us out the other side so that we're ready to start to think about how we might like to feel not stagnated, that we have some agency over our careers and what's going on in our lives. Now, the second phase of this cycle is frustration. So how do we recognize frustration? Now, because this is a sort of much more ubiquitous feeling, you will probably notice it much more quickly in yourself. So have you got a sense of like listlessness or a sort of sense of dissatisfaction? Do you notice yourself sighing when you've got to do things a little bit more? Do you notice yourself daydreaming and kind of thinking, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if, or I'd really like to, but then they're quite vague. They don't have it's not a plan. It's a very vague idea of like, you just want to be somewhere else, somewhere different. And maybe you think, well, perhaps if I change careers or if I retrained or, if I cut back my hours or if I increase my hours, what is it? So there's a sort of vague, not quite rightness about the situation. The other things that you might notice yourself doing, and not everybody has this, but some people definitely do, is you start to, when other people are doing well, when they have, you know that perhaps they weren't a confident speaker and suddenly they find some confidence or they're starting to do things that they weren't doing before. When you see them doing those things, you don't feel good. You're not looking at them going, oh, that's amazing. I'm so proud that they've done that thing. That's amazing. I love that they've done that for themselves. You're like, oh, well, she's gone and done this or he's gone and done that. And it kind of feels a little bit icky. It's not a nice feeling when you're watching other people. And sometimes you might find yourself noticing you making excuses. So, oh, well, it's all right for them because they've got so-and-so support, or their partner does X, Y, and Z, or it's all right for them because, well, they're just super confident, aren't they? And so you start to find lots of excuses why it was possible for them, but the sort of underlying idea is that it's just not possible for you because somehow they are different from you. They're not the same. Now, obviously, in terms of personality, they're not the same, but they're a human being the same as us. So we're making excuses is the word that I like to use here. They're making excuses as to why it's okay for them, but it will never be okay for us. So those are the ways that you can recognize that you are in the recrimination, the frustration phase. But what do you do about it? Well, number one is you do go and congratulate those people that are doing really well. So if there's people around you who are doing great stuff, and it might be somebody who's moved from being stagnated or frustrated and they've moved into this space of being a much more confident speaker, or it might be somebody who's a confident speaker anyway. And you go and you congratulate and say, that was really great. I loved listening to you talk about X, Y, or Z, or that was so helpful and really informative. Thank you so much. And so the first part is the congratulations. Now, the second part is you ask them how they did it. How did you become a confident speaker? Or how did you learn how to present? Or how did you learn how to deal with conflict in such an amazing way? And you ask them, and how does it feel now that you do that thing without really thinking about it? And start to have a conversation that's a bit more nuanced about their process and about their journey. And you'll be surprised how many people say, oh God, I used to hate speaking, really used to terrify me, but I worked on X, or I tried to do this, or now I think about Y. And you'll start to learn that they have not always been brilliant, that they do not always enjoy it, but they've learned the skills to be able to do it with much more comfort and much more ease. And it's a really important part of our process to know that everybody else has a process. They didn't just magically wake up one morning to be an incredible speaker or presenter or communicator. Yeah, we all have a process. We all get it wrong at some point. So having that realistic conversation is super helpful because it will reframe lots of things for you. Now, the second thing you're going to do, or you can do if you want to, is to start to make those daydreams into a reality. So instead of like, oh, maybe I should increase my hours, or maybe I should decrease my hours, or maybe I should retrain, instead of doing all of that, you can start asking yourself questions like, what would it be like if I did X? What would it be like if I did Y? What would I get? What would I lose? What would be challenging? What would be fun? And so we start to kind of really solidify the things that we might like to do, because we can do that process and kind of go, oh no, definitely don't want to go there, yuck, or we can do that process and go, actually, that sounds kind of interesting. Maybe I'll explore that a little bit more. So we move away from this vague dissatisfaction and this slight listless, frustrated feeling into a slightly more experimental, sort of scientific phase, if you like. It's like, well, I could do that, or I could do this, but this is the bit that sounds really interesting. That makes me feel excited. So being a bit more scientific, moving away from the vague daydreams, can be really, really helpful to give us a plan to move on. Now, we don't necessarily have to execute any of those things, but thinking more strategically about it can really help us move away from feeling frustrated. And then if you feel like adding in an extra challenge, why not start saying yes to some things? Now, you need to consider, so no blanket yeses to everything, but you need to consider what are the things you really realistically could do if you put your mind to it, or if you had the right kind of support. So my advice would be, if somebody says, could you do X, Y, and Z? Say, that sounds really interesting. I'm going to take a moment to think about it. And depending on how long you've got, that could be an hour or a day or a week. Go in, have a think. Well, what resources do I have? What skills do I have? What would I need support with? Can I do this if I get Y? Can I do this if I get X? So that you are really being logical, scientific, and supportive of yourself to be able to make a sensible decision, a realistic decision as to whether this is a good opportunity for you or not. And you could go through that process and kind of go, no, I really don't want to do it. It's just not for me. And that's absolutely fine, because you've been logical. You haven't made a fear-based decision. You've made a real decision based on logic and emotion, which is the best kind of decision. So that's the frustration stage, and that's how to get out of it. Now, the final stage is the recrimination stage. Now, some of my clients arrive in this phase. Some of them fall into this phase in the first part of coaching. Some of them actually fall into it a little bit later on, and we recognize it for what it is, and then we've got tactics for getting them out of it. But this is the recrimination stage, and it's where your inner critic is absolutely ruling the roost. So all your decisions are based on what your inner critic says. And generally, your inner critic is using very global language. You've always been an anxious speaker. You will never be a confident speaker. You ought to just sit quietly and not get this wrong. Don't do that because you're going to humiliate yourself. They already think you're an idiot, etc., etc. So you can see that it's quite vicious, it's quite brutal, and it's absolutely global. Yeah, always, never. Those kinds of words come up regularly with an inner critic that's in recrimination phase. And so you feel frustrated and annoyed that you're not doing the thing that perhaps you feel you should be doing or you want to be doing. And then you're getting a battering for, not doing it from your inner critic. So your inner critic will tell you not to do it, and then they give you a hard time for not having done it. See, I knew you wouldn't be able to do it. It's called the pincer movement. It's really, really unpleasant. But essentially, you cannot win at this stage with your inner critic. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. It's a really unpleasant place to be in, and it can really diminish people's drive, enthusiasm, self-belief, self-esteem, all of those things. And we really want to try and avoid getting to that third stage, that recrimination stage, if we possibly can. If you're already there, it's fine. Don't worry. I've been there. I've worked with clients who've been there. There is absolutely ways to get out of that place and into a much more productive, healthy mindset, so that you can start to work on your speaking anxiety and build the confidence through speaking. Very, very important to know that the confidence comes from doing. You don't get confidence and then start doing. It doesn't work that way. You start doing to build the confidence. But we need to get your inner critic in check so that you can build yourself the right kind of mindset and the skills to be able to start doing. So what's the first thing you need to do? You need to have a meaningful conversation with your inner critic. And I'm going to tell you about 2 ways that recently that my clients have used to have really meaningful conversations with their inner critic. One was a lady who basically stood in front of her mirror in her bathroom. She was herself, and she pretended that her reflection was her inner critic. And she just let her inner critic rip and say all the things that it wanted to say about a particular thing she was about to go and do. And then she just said, okay, thank you. I hear you. I understand what you're trying to do. You're trying to keep me safe. I totally appreciate that. But here's why I'm going to do that thing anyway. Here's what I've done. Here's how I've prepared. This is what's going to happen if things go well. This is what's going to happen when things go wrong. So she would just have this really rational, sensible, thought through conversation with her inner critic, and the inner critic kind of just went, oh, and all the wind went out of the sails, and the vitriol of the inner critic was really, really massively reduced by having that sensible conversation. And she felt then she was able to go out, do the thing that she wanted to do. She did do it really well, came back and felt amazing. So by doing, she'd built her confidence by and through having that conversation with her inner critic. I had another client who happened to be an artist, and she had a particularly vicious, aggressive, male-voiced inner critic. And we talked about why that might be. And what she did was she went away and she drew a cartoon of this inner critic voice. So this, in her mind's eye, originally, this inner critic was huge. It was a great towering male voice, male body. And so she shrank it down. She drew this funny little cartoon with this little, he had huge eyes, big nose, big ears, funny hair. And she sat the little caricature really on her shoulder. She gave him a funny name. She called him Nigel, and she gave him a silly voice. So he stopped having this great booming voice that was slightly scary. And she gave him this really funny, like nasal voice. And so Nigel would talk to her like this. And so she was then able to go, oh, it's Nigel, and just brush him off her shoulder, because she was able to recognize very instantly that was a Nigel thing. It was a thought. It's not her. And so she was able to dismiss Nigel's rantings and get on with the thing that she really, really wanted to do. So recognizing you're in the recrimination phase is pretty easy. You know that your inner critic is in charge. It's making the decisions, having a rational conversation with it, and reframing why you're doing certain things to your inner critic is really helpful for diminishing the impact that it can have. I hope you found today really useful. Recognizing where we are, recognizing so that we can reorient ourselves, so that we can make a plan, is an essential part of moving from where we are to where we'd much, much rather be. And the model that we've looked at today is the stagnation, frustration, and recrimination model. And really with all of them, with all of those phases, there are the three things that we need to do, those fundamental blocks that we need to do in order to move through any of them. Notice, acknowledge, and accept. Until we do those things, we are fighting against ourselves, and it's very hard to move through and start doing something better, more interesting, and more fruitful for ourselves. So really those three things are essential at each stage, because if we don't do that, we don't know where we are, we don't know where we need to go to next. With the stagnation phase, you can recognize you're there because you have Groundhog Days. It is pretty repetitious. Nothing really changes. You don't feel challenged, but you don't feel happy and comfortable either. So what do? You start to notice what's going on, and then start to notice what you're saying no to. With the frustration phase, you can notice when you are, when you're feeling just like, just notice what it's feeling like, and notice the excuses that you're making for not doing things. Oh, well, I can't do that because, and if I did this, and notice the excuses that you're making. What are you going to do? You're going to go and congratulate people who are doing really well. You're going to ask them what their roadmap is, and you're going to formulate yourself a plan to get yourself out of your frustrated state. Recrimination. We all know what it's like. Inner critics having a party. It is a pretty unpleasant place to be. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. The only way to get out of this is notice that that's going on, acknowledge that that's what's going on, and then have a meaningful conversation with your inner critic to say, thank you, I appreciate all the work that you're doing, but I have got this. I promise you. And if I haven't got this, I will cope anyway. Very important that the inner critic knows that you're going to cope, whether you have massive success or it turns into a great big flop. It doesn't matter. You will be fine. So those are the stages, and those are the things that you can do. I hope you found today useful. And I hope you've recognized yourself somewhere in all of that. If you want to have a further chat, please don't hesitate. Book in, we'll have a coffee chat. I can talk about this stuff all day. Take care, and I will speak to you soon. Bye for now.